What's cracking, guys? Omar Isov here, back with another video. Guess what? We're talking about the deadlift. Yes, we are. Some people might be thinking to themselves, oh man, another deadlift video? Listen, do you deadlift 600 pounds or more? If you do, I'm sorry. Hey, if you don't want to stick around, you want to go back to Pornhub, that's cool. For the rest of us, the deadlift is a technical movement. There are a few major differences I've changed when it comes to my deadlift setup and the execution that I did not do previously. So we're going to call this maybe a more loose, informal version of how to deadlift, how specifically I deadlift, how I deadlifted 600 pounds. I'm going to give a lot of carryover to the viewer, to you guys, how you can apply some of these steps. There's at least 4 to 5 different key changes I've made over several years ago. I had to make these changes, quite frankly, because I injured my back 2 years ago, and rebuilding, I really had to take a look at the deadlift and how to deadlift properly for my body. And there is an important note before we really begin this video, and that note would be there's a difference between trying to optimize your technique for safety and then trying to optimize it to lift as much as possible. And what I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about that thoracic rounding, which I can and do believe it can be beneficial for most lifters to execute it. However, for this one, for the setup, you're going to see when I pulled 602 pounds, the technique I used was a safer technique. And this is now the technique I'll be using moving forward. I lose, for instance, A, some speed off the floor, so I take a little bit more time. B, it's probably more structurally sound when it comes to my back, but that limits then the total pulling power. So we're not just talking about how to maximize the deadlift, maximize how much you pull, but how much you can pull safely. So that's the key thing I want to say. And this comes after the last 2 years. I waited till I hit a PR before I could confidently talk about these big changes. The concepts I want to talk about today, the 5 major changes, would be 1, foot position, so stance width and then actual foot position. And then I want to talk about number 2, grip, hook grip. I've talked about that before, I just want to reiterate that. Point number 3, I want to talk about grip width, how far apart, where I've actually gone wider than normal, and how that's going to help, I personally feel for myself, engage my lats. So that's point number 3. Point number 4, we'll be pulling with more of a flat back, really in the true sense of flat back, rather than rounding a little bit with that thoracic area. And then finally, point number 5 will be that setup, the hip position, breath when I take my breath, and then finally the execution of the lift, how I gradually increase the intensity. So there's no yanking of the bar. Really, I'm trying to increase that tension over a period of about half a second before it breaks the floor. So 5 big differences from before. Let's break this down. I do feel, once again, there is a lot of carryover for most people watching. Some things will definitely clip. Some other things you might think to yourself, oh, that's not for me, and that's totally fine. So let's break this down. The first part right here, when we talk about the deadlift, I want to talk about stance width. First, I want to give a shout out to all the Peach Boys out there, because traditionally when you see people deadlift or you hear about how to deadlift and we talk about stance width, it's absolutely true. You should kind of jump up like you're going to try and do an athletic jump to try and see how you land. I think Eric Cressy was the first person to say that. And how you land generally will dictate how you should deadlift, the foot position, where you could generate the most amount of power, right? And what you'll notice for most people, it's roughly shoulder width apart. And that seems to be the case for a lot of people. However, some individuals try and mimic some of the great deadlifters, and they'll notice they go pretty close to hand. So if this is shoulder width apart, something like this, if we just come over here, what will tend to happen, some people will go a little bit more narrow, and I kind of fell victim to this for a period of time where I thought, obviously, and this is true in an absolute sense, if your feet are a little closer together, your hands are a little closer together, what ends up happening, then it's a little bit less range of motion. Think about it. If we went super wide, so a super wide grip, our legs were wider, which means we have to grip it wider, the bar has to travel a little bit further, more total work. However, we encounter one major issue. This is dependent upon how your hip anatomy is set up. For myself, I got a little bit of wider hips. I got some birthing hips. I got hips of power. Okay, we got some Peach Boys going on here. And so what would happen when I chose a traditional stance, and I use this for quite a period of time, when I'd get down and I'd get down into that position to pull, what would end up happening, I'd feel my hips jamming up. And we could do that simple test. I got to give a huge shout out to Dean Somerset. But if you go against the wall and you basically try and lift your knee as high as possible using that hip flexion, you could kind of discover how far you can bring up your knee. And what we can discover, if you bring it straight up or you angle it out by maybe just 5 degrees like so, can you bring it up a little bit higher? We talk about hip anatomy. For myself, when I set up with that closer stance, what would end up happening, hips would jam, I'd get in this position, I wouldn't be able to properly utilize my glutes. And so what would end up happening, my hips would rise because glutes wouldn't be taken over, my lower back would take over. I just wouldn't feel it. And so I encountered a lot of issues, both when it comes to my back, as well as just technical issues, my hips rising early. What I found changed all this, and I was experimenting over time. So let's say this is roughly shoulder width apart, okay? We agree this is roughly shoulder width apart. It's going just a little bit wider, so a smidgen wider, and then also angling my feet out a little bit more. What do we find when we angle our feet out a little bit more? Again, it's all about glute involvement. You only got to take a look at where you're strong. For myself, where I set up all the pulling power, I got a big old ass. I might as well use it. Might as well use the glutes. They're the biggest muscle group in the body. And so what I'll tend to do and what I tend to notice, this is more anecdotal, but again, I'm sharing how I deadlift, what has worked for me. When I angle my feet out a little bit more, I find I can engage my glutes a little bit more. I find that it helps me break the floor slightly faster. So I take my time when it comes to the conventional pull, but I still find when I angle my feet out, because then I am allowed to externally rotate my hips, and what ends up happening, my knees, my actual foot position, if you notice, my legs are a little bit bowed almost, it looks like. So when I externally rotate, when I set up, so a little bit wider than shoulder width apart, angle my feet out, what will end up happening, knees are now going over the toes. If we look at the knee position relative to everything else, it's actually a little bit wider. I actually look, and people have left comments, which is partially why I'm making this video, is that I'm allowing space for my hips to sink in between my legs. In this position here, so let's say this is the traditional, like you see a lot of people that pull really well, maybe their hips are a little bit more narrow. We're not talking Eddie Hall, we're gonna get to the strongman competitors in a second, but let's say more slight framed individuals, they'll pull with a closer stance. They have more narrow hips, I tend to observe. And so they'll pull like this. When I find my hips jam up, I can't feel or I can't activate my glutes, and what will end up happening, my hips will kind of rise like that. Instead, we go a little bit wider than shoulder width, so that's point number one. We angle the feet out. If you find for yourself, just your hips, maybe you have also slightly wider hips and just that closer or shoulder width stance didn't quite work when you try conventional pulls, try just a little bit wider, angle the feet out, externally rotate when it comes to the hips, so think we're opening the knees, set up into that position and just see when you pull how it feels, that difference. So point number one, it all begins with a stance. Moving forward to point number two, because they're kind of correlated, I will talk about hook grip quickly, just because hook grip is something that I do. Why do I like to hook grip? Well, if you can do it, if you do have the grip and it's something that you could build up over time, we'll link my whole video on hook grip in the comment section below in the description. But essentially, the hook grip prevents the helicoptering, when you see someone kind of helicopter on the deadlift, so they'll pick up the deadlift and it'll look like this, where this hand, because this hand right here is internally rotated, this hand's externally rotated, and when they pick it up, maybe their body will twist and they don't realize that because what feels natural and aligned for your body might not actually be the reality. So you think that you're aligned, but actually, instead of pulling straight like this, when you set up, you end up pulling like this, and so when you pull, you end up twisting a little bit like that as you pull. That's super exaggerated, but it's far too common. If you can avoid all that, I would recommend the hook grip. The only downside, if I'm being straight up with you guys, I haven't talked about before when it comes to the hook grip, the pulling power I find out of the bottom is a little bit slower. It's a little bit slower because you need to make sure you're setting the hook grip right. And what I mean by that, if you don't set up your hook grip right and you go to pull, what will end up happening is that the bar could slip out of your hands. So it requires a little bit more time to execute, and that'll bring me to point number 5, how you actually execute the deadlift, where you take a little bit more time, but that's all good. So we start with our feet slightly wider, slightly a keyword, wider than shoulder width apart. Once again, bar over midfoot, feet slightly angled out. We externally rotate, cool. Then when we go to hook grip, remember the hook grip, we're basically pulling the fingers over like so. So it means that we're using these first 3 fingers underneath to create that hook. It's far superior to a double overhand grip. When we do the hook grip, however, we want to make sure that we internally rotate with our hands, so actually the lats flare out, you internally rotate, and then you pull the bar back into position. That'll allow you, A, to activate your lats, but B, also to lock that hook grip into place. So hook grip is the grip that I would recommend moving forward for everyone if you can. There's no reason why you shouldn't. That's something that's universal. That's point number 2. Gonna glaze over that one. Point number 3 I want to talk about, which is probably the second most common question I get asked with my new deadlift setup, is that my hand position, if you notice, it's actually a little bit wider than traditional. And this is true, like I'm not gonna deny this. The wider your hand position, like if we go snatch grip deadlift, we could just take a look right here to the outer limit. We'll just see from here, where it is on my hip, we'll notice it's quite high up the lockout. So if you go super wide on the deadlift, and we deadlift the weight right here, you'll notice that the lockout is about 3-4 inches higher. So we're not talking about an exceptionally wide grip, but you'll notice I grip definitely wider than most people. And there's a simple reason for that. If we're trying to create space for our hips, if you got wider set hips, birth and hips, hashtag team birth and hips, and we set up slightly wider than the shoulder width apart, we externally rotate, we get our hips in between, you'll notice our knees will be a little bit pointed out almost, it looks like, right? And so when we set up here, what would always happen to me, and I always notice this, I'd do mixed grip, and I would end up kind of trying to get in position, getting my hands in line with my feet, and I actually would push a knee inside, or both knees inside, and that would shut off my glutes. So choosing a closer hand position, once again, because we want to shorten the total range of motion, would always limit how much I can actually pull, because it limits how much I can use my glutes. What we'll do instead is choose a comfortable position with the hands, actually going slightly wider than you're probably used to. I find this really helps for myself. I also helps it find, for me, my lats in order for them to be engaged, which allows my back to be a little bit flatter. So what we do here, if this is our knees, and this is maybe traditional, we would set up maybe something like that you're used to. We would go just about an inch wider either side. I don't think in reality when it comes to the lockout, so when we bring up the weight here, with the new position, hook grip, just take a big breath, pick it up and lock out. I don't think that inch total difference in your grip width will really interfere when it comes to your lockout power. I find, if anything, from all the other things I built up with my deadlift feels in general stronger. So we choose a grip that's actually a little bit wider than normal. And we also, what I find, because if you just think about it like this, and maybe it's because I did over 10,000 pull-ups in an entire year, it's almost like my pull-up position where I find it easier if we think about flaring our lats. When we flare our lats, we don't flare our lats like that. We flare our lats, and we notice our hands kind of gravitate a little bit further away. And if we notice on the setup, when we go to pull, so from here I flare my lats, they're like this, I come down to the ground, that's pretty much where I grab. And what I'm able to find, or what I find for myself, it keeps my back more flat. Why? Well, if I could flare my lats out, and if I could keep them tight, so I set up in this position, that's why I take my time. I get the lats kind of flared, so my back is nice and flat. My back then can act as a hinge. As I pick up the weight from the side angle, what we'll see right here, when I pick up the weight, the back remains flat. And that was maybe something that people noted versus my old deadlift when I did 585, 565, 545, honestly, is probably the worst one. My hips rose early because my feet were too narrow for my body. I was using all my lower back, none of my glutes, and then my back also, it would round more as I pulled the bar further up my body. So instead, what we do, we set up, once again, foot position, we get that hook grip going on, we flare the lats, and then when we pick it up, we pull the bar, obviously, to help us get into position, pull the bar, lock out, no problem. So point number 3, I would definitely say, would be hand position. Don't be scared to go a little bit further out. I also find, sneak tip, pro tip right here, for the hook grip users, I think it's easier to grab hook grip with hands a little bit wider. Why? Well, once again, we talk about internal rotation. The further out we go, the easier it is with our lats and everything to internally rotate and then just pull the bar right back, as opposed to being close and inside with the body. I find going a little bit wider makes it a little bit easier with the hook grip. So number 3 that we want to talk about there, grip width going a little bit wider than conventional. Again, keep in mind, this isn't just how to optimize when it comes to strength, it's also how to optimize for your body and optimize for safety. Point number 4 that I want to talk about. I want to talk about back position. I want to talk a little bit about that thoracic rounding. I do not think thoracic rounding is a problem whatsoever. And what I mean by that, well, if you set up with your body, I'll link in the description of the video with Jeremy Hamilton, you'll notice that a lot of expert pullers, really, if you look at any of the all-time great conventional pullers, they'll have a little bit of upper back rounding. What does this do when you round your upper back a little bit when you set up? Simple, it allows your hips to remain a little bit closer to the bar. So upper back rounds a little bit, you could pick up the bar, and as you pick up the bar is actually closer to the hips to initiate the pull, which means if you're fast off the ground, it really helps you develop that momentum, which hopefully will carry you towards your lockout, a strong lockout. So there's no denying, and I personally feel rounding your upper back a little bit again when you become more of an elite puller, advanced puller, is a good idea. Me, coming back from a back injury where I kind of want to keep my back in a neutral position. I want to keep it wherever it's set. I want to keep it that way. I found when it came to a little bit of thoracic rounding, I would lose that kinesthetic sense of awareness of my body, where it is relative to everything else. I was more likely to round excessively as I began to pull. So I eliminated that. That's point number 4, whether to keep the back flat or slightly rounded. Again, we don't want to go from slightly rounded to excessively rounded. I like to try and keep the back flat. That's probably the number one thing most people notice, that on the 602 pull, if we got a side angle of that, else was there, the back looked pretty damn flat. And so what we want to focus on when we talk about that, I said point 3, grip position, the lats coming into play. I like to think now, instead of rounding, like lats kind of in the pocket when you do thoracic rounding, I like to think just flaring the lats a little bit, keeping them tight as if you want to keep the whole back flat, right? So from this position here, when we hook grip and we set up, knees are out. When we externally rotate back, our lats then are set up in a place, shoulders slightly in front of the bar, and then we initiate the pull. So point number 4, whether to pull with a flat back or not, for optimal safety, again, there's so many people that pull with a rounded back, but I'm talking about myself, flat back. We go with flat back. Finally, point number 5, actually executing the lift. This is quite different. If we throw a clip here of my 2012 deadlift when I did 520 pounds, hell, when I did 540 pounds, 545 pounds, or even a little bit of that 585 pounds, well, you'll notice I sacrificed position early, and this is very common on the deadlift, in order to break the ground faster. So there'll be a little bit of that yanking. What does yanking look like? Here's how I shoot out my L5. It's when you grab the bar excessively, super fast, to try and pull it fast up. So you're basically using a little bit of a spring, like momentum, using your back. All the load pretty much goes towards your lower back. That's why you'll find a lot of people that deadlift a lot of weight incorrectly, they'll have really well-developed lower erectors, as well as people that do deadlift it correctly, but in particular those, because when you yank, it immediately goes all the pressure towards your lower back. We want to eliminate that. So the pulling method I've kind of implemented, you could do several different ones. You can either take a breath at the top, set up, and then begin to pull. That works great when it came to the mixed grip. I can't do that anymore when it comes to the hook grip. Why? Too damn long. So if you set up with a hook grip, you take that breath, you kind of brace. I still brace just as a cue, but it's not my final breath. By the time you set up 1 thumb, 2 thumbs, you kind of lock the hands into position. It's probably 7 seconds. It's too long to hold your breath. At the same time, I'm gonna be straight up. I'm not flexible enough to bring my hips up and back down yet as a coil, kind of as a spring, in order to develop a little bit of that momentum. You'll see a lot of people that deadlift a hell of a lot of weight utilize this technique. I think it's valid. For myself, just my back and everything, I kind of call it the 0 to 100 method, where I apply gradually over a period of about half a second, more and more tension to the bar. And what I mean by that is I'll set up instead. So instead of going either for the yanking method, that's totally out, or a little bit of that spring method, maybe with your hamstrings, what I'll do instead, we set up here, we take that breath, come down, find the position, and once the position is found, take that big final breath, brace, and then what I'll do, instead of just pulling the bar immediately off the ground, what I'll do over a period of half a second, I'll go from 0 pounds of pressure to whatever I'm trying to lift, let's say 135 pounds, 600 pounds, whatever that amount necessary to break the ground, and rapidly then accelerate it. So it doesn't go just from 0 to 100 instantaneously. It actually goes over a period of about half a second. So it's a little bit slower to pull off the ground, but if you notice, every single set I've done since utilizing this technique, my form stays, and that makes for an easier lockout, I truly feel. So here, we take that setup, big breath, and really, if this was like 600 pounds, I'm gonna demonstrate what it kind of would look like and how it looked like when I did pull 600 pounds, is we apply pressure, pressure, pressure. I'm gonna slow this down. Instead of half a second, it'll take about 3 seconds. So we're applying pressure from like 0 pounds to like 300 pounds, 400 pounds, 600 pounds, bar breaks, lift the weight, lockout. So it's not an immediate, fast, explosive movement. The reason behind that is I personally find if you do it that style, yanking becomes all too common. We'll tend to get out of position. There's no real reason, especially if you want to deadlift with correct technique, to immediately fire it on. Yes, get excited, get super fired up. And that half a second, again, keep in mind, a true half a second the difference would be the following if I was just to demonstrate it with this bar right here. So let's go with a perfect pull where you don't take any pause. So you set up, you pull like that. If you take half a second, you go from here. You're just slightly slowing that acceleration to guarantee you're in a proper position. Guys, those 5 major differences from before to now, I truly feel have helped my deadlift, have helped me deadlift more safely, stronger over time, in particular for my body, and I can't stress that enough. There will be a good amount of carryover when it comes to you, the viewer. Some of it might not fit. So for yourself, we talked about 5 points. We talked about stance width. I said for myself, again, a little wider set hips, birthing hips, so we go a little bit wider. When I went closer and we did that test Dean Somerset style, my hips would jam up. So instead of inside shoulder width or shoulder width, we go a little bit wider. Foot angle, same thing, anecdotal, but I do find it helps me break the floor a little bit with my glutes. I find the next day a good indicator, hey, are you training the right area? What's sore? This whole last phase over 4 months after I would deadlift, before years past, it might be a little bit glutes, a little bit hamstrings, also lower back. Now moving forward, it's a lot more glutes. So we utilize that in order to activate our glutes more. So that's point number 1, stance width. Point number 2, hook grip. If you can, if you got the hands, trust me, unless you got super tiny small hands, you could definitely hook grip. Get that hook grip set up, check out that video. 3, grip width. Don't be afraid to go a little bit wider than you think is normal. We're not going super wide like a snatch grip, but the wider I went, just by about an inch, I found it easier, A, to activate my lats. Keep in mind that cue here, or lats flared slightly. Get the knees also, so we're not pushing the knees in. So again, the legs are being activated properly. Point number 4, I am now pulling with more of a flat back. There might be a little bit of rounding, but I used to round my back a little bit more to close that distance between the hip and the actual bar when I'm pulling. Now we go with a flatter back. It's just safer overall. And finally, point number 5, gradually over a period of just half a second, accelerating the force you generate into the bar to pull it off the ground. So we don't yank the bar, we develop that tension, and then finally, once we break the floor, you'll notice that your technique stays in place. So your hips won't rise up, you won't torpedo forward, the bar won't drift forward, you're able to maintain that solid form. 5 big tips. I hope you enjoyed this video. This is the informal, consider it. You guys wanted to see the big differences. A lot of people were noting changes to my deadlift, like what the hell is going on? I've been thinking about this a lot. I smashed 602 pounds. I hit the goal that I had, a 602 pound deadlift. What's next? I don't know. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you liked the video, else how many likes we can go for?
12,000.
What happens if they give 12,000 likes? Give me...
They get another video.
12,000 likes and Else will shave his head on this channel live in front of your steaming naked eyes. And I'll be seeing all you guys, my rascals, in that next video. Else, why do you look shocked?